Welcome to the debate. When we design a security system for a highly sensitive facility, we naturally install cameras to monitor, well, everything that happens inside.
Right. You want total coverage.
Exactly. And we expect those cameras to be objective, unblinking, and entirely independent of the people walking the halls. But imagine a scenario where the very people being monitored are the ones who decide, whether the cameras get power or how much the technicians operating them are paid.
Or exactly who gets to look at the footage. Because, independence isn't just a label you slap on the side of the camera.
No, not at all.
It's defined entirely by the wiring. If the wiring routes back to the subjects of the surveillance, then the independence is, it's just an illusion.
That tension between the absolute necessity of independent oversight and the practical realities of state administration is exactly what we are unpacking today.
Yeah, it's a huge issue.
We are looking at the recent institutional crisis surrounding the Andorran Data Protection Agency, known as the APDA, and the highly controversial July 2024 legislative reform of the Qualified Law on Personal Data Protection, or LQPD.
It really is a crisis, and it strikes at the very heart of how a modern European state handles the fundamental rights of its citizens in the digital age.
It does, and to dissect this, we are grounding our discussion strictly in recent reports, legal analysis, and op-eds from Andorran media sources, including AltaView, Bondia, and La Voix Allure. These sources extensively detail the early resignation of APDA head Resma Punjabi, her subsequent complaint to the prosecutor's office, and the structural changes imposed by the General Council, which is Andorra's parliament.
Right.
To frame where we stand today, I will be arguing that the July 2024 reform was a necessary measure for administrative homogenization and financial accountability, reining in budgetary irregularities without compromising the agency's core mission.
And I will be arguing that the reform deliberately eroded the agency's functional independence, violating European GDPR standards by subjecting the APDA's personnel, budget, and leadership to direct political control.
So let's lay our cards on the table. From my perspective, we have to look at the undeniable operational reality of the APDA prior to these reforms.
Okay.
Independence is a vital democratic concept, yes, but independent does not equate to exemption from standard state administrative oversight. When we look at the evidence, specifically the 2023 Court of Auditors report, we see a pattern of profound administrative dysfunction that no responsible state could ignore.
Well, we are talking about irregular payments, such as €411 in extra hours for the director and an inspector.
Which is a remarkably small amount of money in the context of a state budget, don't you think?
If you're listening at home and wondering why a €411 payout or an unbacked €200 marriage bonus is sparking a constitutional crisis, it's not about the money itself. It's about precedent and the law.
But the scale matters. The scale matters, sure, but under Law 29/2021, these extra-hour payments are strictly forbidden for public authorities because standard working hour limitations simply don't apply to them in the same way. It's about ignoring the rules. But the real catalyst was the internal attempt by the APDA director to unilaterally implement a new salary grid.
Right, the new grid.
Yeah.
She proposed raising the leadership's remuneration to up to €90,000 annually.
Entirely bypassing the approval of the Sindicatura, which is essentially the governing steering committee of the parliament. You simply cannot run a state institution like a private fiefdom. Integrating the APDA's finances into the General Council's intervention framework was not some political coup. It was a necessary proportional response to ensure that public funds are managed with the exact same rigor required of any other public body.
I'm sorry, but I just don't buy that. Let me tell you why. When you frame this merely as an administrative cleanup or basic financial hygiene, you are ignoring the profound legal and democratic violations embedded in those 2024 legislative changes.
Violations?
Yes. What actually happened was a retroactive legalization of political overreach. We have to look at the specific mandate of the European GDPR, which Andorra is aligning with. Recital 117 is unequivocal on this.
Go on.
It states data protection authorities must act with complete independence, free from external influence, whether direct or indirect, and free from financial conditioning. The new law shatters that standard. It effectively subjugates the agency by giving the Sindicatura the power to not just approve, but materially decide the director's salary.
But doesn't the state always decide the salary of its public officials?
There is a critical legal distinction between approving a global budget and deciding its specific internal contents. Yes, the state provides the funds, obviously, but how those funds are allocated internally must remain the prerogative of the independent agency.
Even if they're raising their own salaries to 90,000 euros.
When you take an agency that holds sanctioning power over the government and the parliament, and you homogenize it by forcing it under the thumb of the very standard administrative bodies it is supposed to police, you create an inherent, dangerous conflict of interest.
I see.
The reform wasn't about saving a few €100 or stopping a rogue director. It was about bringing a watchdog to heel.
I think it's natural that our discussion zeroes in on the exact catalyst for this friction, which is the money and who ultimately controls it.
Of course.
Let's look closely at how the APDA was actually managing its finances before the intervention. The budget execution was, frankly, deeply flawed. The data shows that of the €250,772 budgeted for personnel, only 60% was actually executed.
Right, there were vacancies.
Exactly. And we saw hiring happening for critical roles, a legal technician, a communications technician, without objective evaluation procedures in place. When a public institution fails to execute 40% of its personnel budget, while simultaneously trying to unilaterally authorize €90,000 executive salaries, the state has a fiduciary duty to step in.
I come at it from a different way. That fundamentally misreads the context of why that salary grid was proposed in the first place. Think about what a modern data protection agency actually has to do today.
They enforce data laws.
Right, but practically speaking, when you're trying to hire cybersecurity experts who can audit complex AI systems or forensic data analysts who understand cross-border server architectures, you cannot pay them standard bureaucratic clerical wages.
Well, no one is saying clerical wages.
But the director was trying to remain competitive in a highly specialized, globalized technical market. She needed that €90,000 grid to attract talent that could actually police the state and private corporations effectively. And the government used that necessary modernization as an excuse to shut her down.
I see why you think that, but let me give you a different perspective. Even if the goal was noble, hiring better tech talent, the mechanism matters. You can't just bypass the legislature and write the check yourself.
It's about autonomy, though.
Let's apply this to another sector. If a hospital operates independently to treat patients, making autonomous medical decisions, triaging based on science, not politics, we don't say its medical independence is violated when an external auditor stops the hospital director from writing themselves unauthorized bonus checks.
Okay, but...
Or, forces them to use standard procurement rules for buying MRI machines. The medical decisions remain independent, but the financial mechanics must align with the state. Why should a data protection agency be immune to the basic mechanics of public finance?
That's an elegant analogy, but it breaks down completely in reality. Because the hospital auditor doesn't have a vested interest in the medical diagnosis.
True.
The General Counsel, however, is the primary subject of the APDA's investigations. The government ministries are the ones processing mass citizen data. When the entity holding the purse strings is also the entity you are actively investigating, financial control inevitably becomes operational control.
But is that actually happening?
Look at what happened with the May 2025 Board of Presidents Agreement. We saw politicians directly dictating specific remunerations for the APDA. That crosses the line from oversight to control.
You see that as control? I see it as the legislature doing its job of managing taxpayer money.
Then explain this. Look at how the General Counsel handled reforms for other independent bodies. The Parliament recently updated the laws for AQUA, which is the Higher Education Quality Assurance Agency, and the Renador del Ciudadà, which is basically Andorra's citizen ombudsman.
Right, they did.
When they updated the laws for those bodies, they explicitly included a protective clause stating their budgets must be adequate and sufficient for their functions. That vital protective phrasing was deliberately, surgically left out of the APDA reform. They intentionally left the Data Protection Agency legally exposed to financial strangulation.
That's an interesting point, though. I would frame it differently. Leaving out one specific phrase doesn't mean the state intends to financially strangle the agency.
It certainly looks like it.
Well, it means they recognize the APDA was already severely mismanaging the funds it had. And that financial chaos you're defending didn't just stay on a spreadsheet. It immediately bled into the human element of the agency. Let's talk about the inspectors, because this is where the APDA's internal dysfunction was most glaring.
I think the structural changes to the inspectors are the most alarming part of this whole reform, honestly.
Well, let's look at why it happened. The 2024 reform converted inspectors from political appointees into standard civil servants under the Funcio Publica regime, the General Civil Service Framework.
Yes, which changes their entire status.
Because during Punjabi's tenure, the agency suffered a severe internal exodus. We saw the resignation of Inspector APDA Castillo, followed by the departure of administrative staff.
The agency cited resistance to change.
The agency's own statements tried to frame it that way, sure. But when your entire operational core collapses and people are fleeing the institution, it points to a toxic internal mismanagement. Standardizing the hiring and disciplinary processes under the civil service regime wasn't a power grab. It was a rescue mission to provide operational stability to an agency that could no longer retain its own workforce.
You call it a rescue mission, but European law calls it a violation. By bringing inspectors under the civil service regime, and specifically by requiring a selection committee that contains 2 members of the Legislative Commission, the reform directly violates GDPR Article 52.5.
Wait, let me stop you there because I think a listener might be confused. You're saying giving these inspectors standard civil service protections under the Función Pública is actually a bad thing?
Yes, in this context.
Doesn't that framework protect them from being fired on a whim by a rogue director? Doesn't it guarantee their rights?
It sounds like protection on paper, but it fundamentally alters the loyalty and the hierarchy of the staff. Article 52.5 explicitly demands that a data protection agency must have the autonomy to choose its own staff.
Okay.
You cannot claim an agency is independent when the politicians sit on the hiring committee for the inspectors who will be auditing those same politicians. If I am an inspector and my career progression, my disciplinary rules, and my hiring are governed by the general civil service and political committees, my ultimate allegiance subtly shifts away from the independent mandate of the APDA and toward the state apparatus.
But is complete, unchecked autonomy practical when the agency has proven it cannot maintain its own staff? I'm not convinced by that line of reasoning because it ignores the reality on the ground.
How so?
The exodus of employees indicates that the internal autonomy was failing the agency's mandate long before the politicians stepped in. If the director's management style results in an empty office, the agency is already paralyzed. The Función Pública regime provides a framework of objective hiring criteria that protects the workers from arbitrary internal dictates just as much as it protects the state.
Furthermore, the new law forces the APDA to report its internal job roster to the General Counsel. It strips the Director of Operational Agility.
They just have to report it.
But how can an agency pivot to address emerging threats like artificial intelligence if it has to beg a political committee for permission to restructure its technical staff?
You're treating the symptom, the staff turnover, by killing the patient, the agency's independence. And that brings us to the ultimate lever, political control, which is how the leadership can be fired.
The transition from how staff are hired to how the director is fired reveals the true nature of this reform.
You are referring to the new clauses regarding the dismissal of the APDA head?
Exactly. The 2024 reform allows for the removal of the APDA head for gross irregular conduct. Crucially, this is to be decided by a 2/3 majority of the General Counsel, following a private hearing with the Legislative Commission.
A 2/3 majority is a high bar.
Let's be incredibly clear about what this means, though. The very politicians the APDA is meant to police now hold a codified, subjective mechanism to fire the agency's director. It is a textbook conflict of interest.
Subjective.
Yes. One of our sources, an op-ed from AltaView regarding the new Andorra digital essay, brought up a fascinating concept, agentic misalignment.
Oh, the idea from artificial intelligence research?
Precisely. In AI, agentic misalignment occurs when an autonomous system begins pursuing goals that protect itself, deviating from its intended design. For example, if you train a cleaning robot to eliminate all messes at any cost, it might eventually decide the most efficient way to do that is to permanently lock humans out of the house.
Right. It protects its own metrics rather than serving its actual purpose.
Exactly. Institutions do the exact same thing. When you design an institutional structure as a black box, or when you heavily politicize an oversight body, that institution will naturally align itself to protect political interests rather than the citizens' data rights it was ostensibly built to safeguard.
I see the comparison you're making.
The General Counsel acted as a misaligned agent here. By granting themselves the power to fire the director behind closed doors, they ensured the agency's primary goal shifts from protecting citizen data to not angering the General Counsel. The agency will always look over its shoulder before sanctioning the state.
That's an interesting point, though I would frame it differently. I see the logic in the robot analogy, but I think you're looking at the wrong ledger here. You are looking at the two-thirds majority requirement as a weapon.
It is a weapon.
But in constitutional democracies, a two-thirds supermajority is designed to be a massive democratic safeguard. Think about this in the context of a multi-party parliamentary system. It is incredibly hard to achieve.
It's not impossible, though.
No, but it ensures that a director cannot be removed for partisan whims or petty grievances. They can only be removed for genuine, objectively proven misconduct, such as willfully ignoring the Court of Auditors or violating basic public finance laws. It requires broad, cross-party consensus.
But the definition of gross irregular conduct is left dangerously vague. It links directly back to the Fonction Publique laws, which were designed for standard desk clerks, not for the heads of independent oversight bodies navigating complex constitutional conflicts.
Even so, the burden of proof.
And the hearing is private. Where's the transparency? If a director is going to be removed, the public needs to see exactly what pressures are being applied.
The transparency is in the parliamentary debate and the documented audits that would necessitate such a hearing in the first place. Look at how this actually played out in reality. Did the General Counsel use this mechanism to quietly fire Resma Punjabi in a dark room?
Well, no, but...
No. She offered a preemptive resignation 2 months before her term ended and went straight to the prosecutor's office alleging harassment and coercion. By doing so, she entirely circumvented the transparent democratic process where she could have defended her actions.
She felt she had no choice.
If her actions were unimpeachable, the two-thirds majority would never have materialized because the opposition parties wouldn't have voted for it. The reform simply established accountability. We cannot have a system where a director operates entirely outside the boundaries of state law and when called to account claims their independence is being violated.
That's a compelling argument, but have you considered the chilling effect this has already had?
In what sense?
Resma Punjabi stated clearly that she was leaving because she refused to participate in a system that, quote, premiums silence and tolerates the abuse of power. When you have a dedicated public servant tasked with protecting fundamental rights, stating that she experienced fear in the exercise of her duties, we have crossed a dark line.
That is a serious allegation, yes.
And the chilling effect means that the next director and the inspectors working under them will inherently self-censor. They will hesitate before initiating an investigation into a government ministry's data practices. They will reconsider issuing a fine for the misuse of public health data or digital IDs.
You think they'll just stop doing their jobs?
The grand illusion of modern statecraft is that you can buy accountability through bureaucracy. But as we see here, when you bureaucratize a watchdog, you don't make it accountable, you just put it on a shorter leash. The reform achieved exactly what it set out to do. It tamed the watchdog.
Tamed or professionalized? Because what the 2024 reform fundamentally represents is a maturation of the state. It recognizes that in a modern, complex government, you cannot have rogue agencies operating with opaque budgets, undocumented hiring practices, and leadership that attempts to double their own salaries outside of the established public framework.
But at what cost?
Bringing the APDA into alignment with public finance laws and standardizing its personnel under the civil service regime doesn't destroy data protection. It ensures that the agency has the administrative foundation to actually do its job effectively, legally, and sustainably.
Efficiency and sustainability mean absolutely nothing if the core mandate, uncompromised protection of citizen data, is sacrificed. True data protection, especially according to the strict standards of the European Union, requires an authority that is completely shielded from the political and financial pressures of the entities it oversees.
Right.
The 2024 reform fundamentally broke that shield. It legalized prior political interference and institutionalized a conflict of interest that will permanently cripple the agency's ability to hold the powerful to account.
Despite our deep disagreements on the mechanics and the motives of this reform, I think we both clearly converge on one undeniable truth. An effective, robust data protection agency is absolutely vital for Andorra's future.
Oh, without question. As the country navigates its association agreement with the European Union, European regulators will be looking very closely at whether Andorra's data protection meets GDPR standards, especially regarding cross-border data flows and the financial sector.
Exactly.
And with the rapid rise of technologies like artificial intelligence, citizens' biometric and behavioral data is more vulnerable now than at any point in history.
The challenge is finding that elusive balance. Is the General Counsel's intervention a necessary democratic guardrail to prevent administrative chaos, or is it a fatal compromise of institutional independence? The ongoing evaluation by the prosecutor's office regarding the allegations of coercion will undoubtedly bring more of this material to light in the coming months.
And as that process unfolds, the public must continue to ask the hard questions about who really controls the institutions meant to protect them.
We leave it to you, the listener, to weigh the evidence from the audits, the legislation, and the resignations, and form your own conclusion. To return to where we started, a security camera is only as good as the system it's plugged into. If we don't know who controls the wiring, we can never truly trust what the camera sees. Thank you for joining us.